welcome to Inside Personal Growth Podcast. Deep dive with us as we unlock the secrets to personal development, empowering you to thrive. Here, growth isn't just a goal, it's a journey. Tune in, transform, and take your life to the next level by listening to just one of our podcasts. Hey, well, welcome back to Inside Personal Growth, another episode. Amy, you do a podcast, so you realize that every time we come on here, we are just blessed beyond belief to have guests like you. And joining me from Los Angeles is Amy Sandler. She is a trainer, a lead coach, a podcast host for Radical Candor, and a mindfulness and breath worker as well. And this is the book we're going to be speaking about today. Good morning to you.
Good morning. I am excited to be with you and talk about Radical Candor and wherever else we go.
I am as well. And I'm going to let the people know also that Amy used to train. She's done a lot of training. She has a lot of background in meditation, mindfulness, breath work. And she worked did you work inside Google teaching the search inside yourself? Or were you just teaching that all over the place?
I was one of the first 30 people certified, accepted to teach the Search Inside Yourself program, which was developed at Google outside of Google. So they had been training it internally. And then in 2014, so it's been over 10 years where they opened it up to start sharing mindfulness-based emotional intelligence outside of Google.
Well, that is a wonderful course. And for all my listeners, just type in Search Inside Yourself. A little bit more. She's a professional speaker, corporate mindfulness trainer, executive coach. As we said, currently serving as lead coach and podcast host of Radical Candor. Go check that out. We will put links in the blog to that as well. She, as I said, previously served in roles including Chief Marketing Officer and Chief Content Officer. And I love your statement here. She believes that genuine curiosity, and boy, do I have a big dose of that, and active listening are the gateways to transformation. And to be a podcast host and guest, I think you have to be curious. You're constantly finding new authors and having them on your show. And I mean, curiosity is like big for me. So we're going to dive right into this because I want you to do more of the talking than me. But first off, start by telling our listeners a little bit about your background. I did tell them a little bit, but such little bit, because I know you've done deep work in the meditation and mindfulness arena. And I think that's what makes you so well suited to actually do the Radical Candor work. And, everybody says, well, how do all these things kind of fit together? It's like me, I have a degree in spiritual psychology, and they go, well, how do you coach business people with that? And I'm like, because everybody has got spirit and hopefully they bring it to work, right? And we all have to find that. So how did your journey lead you to become one of the top trainers for Radical Candor?
Well, it always looks easier to explain it from the rear view mirror, I guess, or looking back. And I really do think that curiosity propelled so much of it. I've always been curious and a seeker, and my background was really in the workplace was in marketing and communications. I went to Harvard undergrad, and then I went to get my MBA in Harvard. And I think a spoiler alert, part of my seeking was like, going to Harvard does not make you feel great about yourself. You need to figure out other ways to kind of fill yourself up from the inside. After business school, my classmates were going into something called the internet. I don't know if you heard about that. Jobs like Yahoo, like fifth employee. But I said, I'm going to go get another degree.
That dates you.
Yeah, it does date me a little bit. And I got my MFA in screenwriting. So I've kind of been on this income minimizing path for a while. Then I became a meditation teacher. I never first of all, that I was going to be a meditation teacher, or B, that was actually something that the workplace would really welcome. For decades, there were really two streams of my life. There was kind of the work and the job, and then there was the personal growth and the curiosity and the seeking. And so you mentioned that Search Inside Yourself program. That was really where I realized that this was something that companies were starting to see the value in. And there was a way where I could bring kind of all of these parts of myself into work. And as you said, it wasn't just something I was able to do. It was, in fact, like a competitive advantage that I had been, spending decades doing this kind of deep dive into personal development, leadership development, spirituality, et cetera. So for the past 10 years, I started teaching mindfulness and emotional intelligence to CEOs. I'd worked in, you're familiar with both YPO, Young Presidents Organization, and Vistage. And so really trying to, at the time, there was a lot of need to explain the value of mindfulness. This was 10 years ago, 8 years ago, there wasn't as much of an awareness. Now, I think one of the really exciting things is that people really do see the value of mindfulness. They do see the value of stillness, of listening, and how these things can actually deepen emotional intelligence, which, to go back to your sort of primary point, I would not be teaching Radical Candor had I not done all of this work. When we think about feedback, I'm very sensitive. In fact, I think it was like my first grade teacher, I had a little note that said, Amy's very sensitive to criticism. She cries, if somebody, criticizes her, et cetera. So I'm very sensitive.
That would be me.
Yeah. Where are all my recovering perfectionists at? Right. So, I teach this stuff because I believe in it and because it holds me accountable to practicing it. Same reason why I feel that way about mindfulness, about attention training, about listening, and certainly about Radical Candor, which for me is really bringing mindfulness and compassion practices in action, in relationship, in conversation with the people that we work with.
It was interesting. I was recently listening to Tim Ferriss with Martha Beck, and I didn't know a lot about Martha Beck's story, but she really told her whole story. And I was like, whoa, talk about radical candor. And that's kind of what she's teaching now, right, to the world, is really kind of radical candor. I don't know for anybody out there, I'm not advocating you go listen to Tim Ferriss's podcast, but I will say that interview with Martha Beck was really something. Now, you host this podcast show, Radical Candor. How did you get involved in that role? Because, I think, okay, a mindfulness meditation teacher might not be wanting to do a podcast show, but you say it's very rewarding and you love doing it. Explain how you got there, because Kim Scott must have said, hey, Amy, you want to do this? And you're like, yeah, I got my hand up for this one.
Yeah, great. Well, first, also say, big fan of Martha Beck. I haven't listened to that conversation, but I will check it out. Radical Candor is, it means a few different things. So Kim Scott, like you mentioned, she and I went to business school together. We actually didn't know each other in business school. We reconnected years later. And so she gave this talk before the book came out, before the book Radical Candor came out, that Kim had worked at Google, she'd worked at Apple, and this is really a book dedicated to how can I succeed without being a jerk. This idea that we can care about the people we work with at the same time we're willing to challenge them directly. So it being Silicon Valley, she does this talk, it goes viral. And so all of a sudden there's all this money to kind of create this company. So it's both a book and it's a training company. So what we do at Radical Candor is we actually do workshops and keynotes and that sort of thing. And Kim knew that I had been doing a lot of workshops. And so I started doing workshops. We were such a small company. So I was chief marketing officer, and then I was chief content officer looking at our content. In terms of the podcast itself, there had actually been a podcast when the company first started, before I joined. And a few years ago, actually, it was before the pandemic, Brandy Neal, who's our director of marketing and content now, she and I were talking about bringing back the podcast. And so we started talking to different firms that might be able to help us. And Then all of a sudden, we sort of got a little stuck. COVID, pandemic, lockdown, and with all of the pain and all of the challenge of that time, like anything with constraint and challenge, sometimes you find opportunity. And so we were like, let's just restart the podcast. And so it was really
Perfect time, right?
Yeah, and so we're sitting in front of our computers, and so really, what it is I will really host the podcast with Kim, the author of Radical Candor and co-founder of the company, and Jason Rosoff, who's our CEO and co-founder. And by the way, I always wanted to be a talk show host. Just going back to curiosity and listening, like to me, it seems like the obvious thing, like you said. What could be better than talking to people and asking them questions and hearing their stories?
It's really interesting because I'm reflecting on the word radical. And just last week, Ken Wilber was on here for his new book, Radical Wholeness. It's a Shambhala Press book. And, it's interesting when you look at this word radical because it stirs up emotion within people, right? Mm-hmm. First off, because you're thinking about, well, when I first grew up, we looked at radical a different way. And so, you say radical candor introduces the idea of caring personally while challenging directly, okay? And I hope that that's the way everybody sees it. How can leaders strike the right balance between these two concepts? And what are some of the common pitfalls that any leader should try and avoid if they can?
Such a great question. With Kim will talk a lot about ways in which the book title land the way it was intended. I'd say the biggest mistake that people make when they hear the phrase radical candor is that they think that means what we would call obnoxious aggression or brutal honesty. By that means you can just say in air quotes, in the spirit of radical candor, and then that gives you carte blanche to just act like, a garden variety jerk and just say whatever it is. And, that shirt's terrible. I hate this podcast. Like that is not the spirit of radical candor. That is the spirit of what we would call obnoxious aggression or brutal honesty. In fact, there was I think it was on HBO, a show called Silicon Valley, where they did a bit of a spoof and satire of radical candor, and they were not doing radical candor. They were doing brutal honesty. What we say...
And it's interesting when you say that because the Martha Beck interview, it was really more brutal honesty in the sense that she says most people are going through their lives telling themselves a lie. Now, that I don't disagree with. We frequently do live with those lies because we don't want to tell the other person. We're afraid to tell the other person. We don't know how to tell the other person. Yeah. Would you say that is also common inside the walls of these big companies? I would say it is, right? And they just don't know how to express it. But your book helps people learn how to express it in a caring way.
Exactly. And one of the things that we like to do is we like to tell stories. We like to tell stories, times when we received radical candor and times when we made mistakes, when we were not acting in a way that was both caring and challenging. One way that can help people think about what radical candor is compassionate candor. The compassion is the care personally part, and the candor is the challenge directly. Another way to think about challenge directly, too, by the way, is to be more. Is my feedback kind and clear? I think about radical candor, about applying it in a conversation. Does the person I'm talking to feel like I care about them? And are they also really clear on what we've discussed? Like that is my goal. So going back to this idea of, that sort of kind is clear, clear is kind, and Brene Brown talks about this a lot. These are really fundamental ideas of truth and love. Like when you really fully abstract them out, it's this idea of truth and love. But I think that the important point, Greg, is that it's going to land differently for different people. There is not one absolute measure of what radical candor looks like. And so it's really about, if you and I are in conversation together, how can I share my perspective in a way that is to be helpful for you, that it's being kind in service of your growth? At the same time, it's clear what I'm asking for you. And so one of the reasons why we share stories about what it looks like is it gives me a chance to say, hey, this is what care personally looks like for me. This is how this person kind of invested in the relationship, like deposits in the relationship bank. So it'd be helpful for me to share a story about when I received Radical Candor, like what that looks like for me, or do you want me to pause here? Where did you
I think it would be good for you to share it, and I'm going to preface that with I remember speaking with Corey Kogan from Franklin Covey, and even though the quadrants, which I don't think all the people listening understand the 4 quadrants.
Yep.
I think to put a context to this, we're looking for the far right-hand corner, almost like Stephen Covey, right? Getting things done, but actually he borrowed that from Eisenhower. And they even said that Covey made it so everyone could use it. Eisenhower didn't. But the reality is you guys have created a little graph. And I think if you talk about that graph for a second, then tell your story, I think people will have a better context for where we're headed. Yeah.
100%. Yeah. Well, we joke that, if you worked in consulting or went to business school, you realize that all of the world's problems can be solved by putting them into like a 2x2 matrix, like what you're talking about. So there's sort of this vertical, y-axis, there's an x-axis. If you imagine like the vertical axis is care personally, right? So there's that compassion part of Radical Candor. And then the horizontal axis is challenge directly. So what you were saying, that kind of top right is Radical Candor. I'm being caring and challenging. One of the things that I think is really helpful about the model and about using these kinds of frameworks is to think about the mistakes that happen when we're not practicing Radical Candor, right? So one mistake that we might make that we just was we're high on challenge. The person knows they're messing up. We're being really clear, but we are not caring about them as a human being. Maybe we're sharing this criticism publicly, right? Kind of front stabbing. We would call this obnoxious aggression. Now, I just want to say with this matrix, this framework, what we call, sort of the 2x2 framework or the quadrants, this is not a personality test. Like, we don't want people to start, putting people into boxes like, oh, my box is a real this and my part this. These are mistakes that we all make in conversation. And so I think the value of this framework, as I kind of talk through it, is to think about, oh gosh, in any conversation, I feel like I'm really high on the challenge here. Do I need to move up on care personally? So it really can be something to help you guide your conversation. So kind of that bottom right, high challenge, low care, we would call that obnoxious aggression. And again, these are behaviors, not personalities. After you acted like a jerk, rather than moving up on care personally, sometimes the human tendency, I know I have it, is to move on over to the left where you end up not caring, not challenging. We call that manipulative insincerity. Mm-hmm. Now, how does this show up at work? This is the meeting after the meeting. Oh, Greg, great idea. Definitely want to do it. And then after this conversation, we end up talking about all the reasons why it's a terrible idea, right? You say one thing to the person's face and another thing about them behind their back. This is sort of, by the way, makes for really good television drama, sort of all the office politics and gossip, et cetera. But this is really the most toxic of workplaces. And it can be fun to tell stories when you've acted like a jerk. When I sent that really obnoxious email and I wrote to the project owner how they weren't listening to me and they were wasting, millions of dollars. And I included the CEO and the head. That was really obnoxiously aggressive to do that publicly. It's, for me, when I think about my values, it's really hard to look at these times when I'm acting in manipulative insincerity, when I'm really thinking about myself much more than the other person. And it can, to give ourselves a little like compassion or grace to kind of think about, why do we act this way? Maybe we're stressed. Maybe we're burnt out. Maybe we feel like we've said this over and over and the person isn't listening. But I'm curious, I kind of want to pause on this one, what comes up for you, Greg, when you think about this behavior where we're not caring, we're not challenging. Again, in that framework, it's kind of the 2x2, the bottom left. What's your own perspective of why we might land in that manipulative insincerity quadrant, talking about people, not to them?
I think, thanks for the question. It's just like a podcast host to ask another
Can't help
podcast
myself.
host a question. So here's what I would say. I'm going to come at this from a Buddhist perspective, and I want you to underline the word perspective. I think much of what happens to us is a result of the perspective in which we carry around with us. So what I would say is, there's frequently pain. Pain can result from this kind of action. The question is, do I have to carry the suffering with it? And that's a choice that I make as a result. Now, if I'm old enough to accept and understand, and I take personal responsibility for whatever it is, I'm 100% responsible. I'm approaching this from a Buddhist perspective right now, but the reality is it's like, hey, really, if you look at that and applied it to that far right quadrant that you were talking about, manipulative, I might not look at it as manipulative. I may rechange my perspective, right? So I know that might not be what you were looking for, but what I would say is, that's the way I would try and frame it for people. Don't take anything personally. We'll go back to Don Miguel Ruiz, right? I mean, the four agreements, right? So yeah. I don't know if that works for you, but the reality is that is a very important element. Is like, I got to try not to take it personally.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting phrase, which I'll come back to in just a moment. So much of radical candor, the reason there is no absolute measure of radical candor, so often people just tell me what to say and tell me what will work. Well, we can't give you a script because, what I'm going to say to Greg in this moment, I don't know how it will land. And so one of the biggest pieces of radical candor is that it's measured not at the speaker's mouth, but at the listener's ear. So I might be kind and clear. I might think I'm being radically candid with you, but how is it landing for you? Maybe you thought I was acting like a jerk. Maybe the challenge wasn't clear. I don't know. And so that's why these are one-on-one conversations. We want them to happen real time. So that's kind of thing one. Thing two, what you said about perspective is so important because we are sharing our perspective with each other. One of the biggest pieces of guidance when we talk about giving feedback, and I also want to make sure I talk about asking for feedback because that's actually where we start in our practice of developing these relationships, is when we are sharing, giving feedback, it's sharing our perspective. And so number one is to share this in a way we would say that's humble, and not humble in the sense to share it humbly that, oh, I am subservient to you, but rather that curiosity. I am looking at this from this perspective. How are you looking at it? That's what we mean by sharing it humbly. So we are very aligned on this idea of sharing perspective. And I think the piece that I'll get into now, and make sure that we talk about the taking things personally, because it's another really interesting part of this. When we go back to that quadrant that you kind of wanted me to walk people through, right? So we have top right, high challenge, high like being clear, being caring is radical candor. The bottom right, obnoxious aggression, high challenge, low care. We just talked about the bottom left, low care, low challenge, manipulative insincerity. Now, when you say about the word manipulative not landing for you, right? So I want to get to that. Kim, intentionally chose phrases and did a lot of work to sort of bring up things that would be as clear as possible. Now, the reason why, and those words, if those words don't work for you, you change. In fact, Kim was working with a group in Japan, and culturally, the idea of radical candor, that those words and challenge and care didn't work. So what they landed on was polite persistence, right? Mm-hmm. So the polite was the sort of culturally, sort of care personally, and the persistence was the challenge directly. So use these words, we all bring a lot of sort of meaning to them. But the reason why on manipulative insincerity versus the top left, which is ruinous empathy, that's high care, low challenge. Now, we would all agree empathy is foundational to your practice of radical candor. But empathy without action can both lead the person themselves to burnout and stress and also have really damaging effects on the other person. And so when we share stories, one of the things that we'll often do is share about, when we've been in these sort of mistake quadrants. And for me, my tendency towards ruinous empathy is why I teach radical candor, because if I really do care about this person, and I almost lost, I did really lose a good friend who had worked for me, because I was so afraid to tell them what they needed to hear. And months passed and months passed and months passed. And finally, we got this new boss, and this person's job was on the line. And I never told them because I was not wanting to hurt their feelings, And then all of a sudden, realizing that their job had been on the line, I was able to save the job, but not the friendship, because this person was like, you never told me for 6 months. And so it's really those painful stories where you realize, gosh, it was ruinous because I was so worried about hurting their feelings. And yeah.
No, you said you were going to tell a story.
Yeah, well, I've shared a couple of stories. I'll share one more.
Was that the story?
The story I wanted to share was what radical candor looks like, but we also share our stories of the mistakes that we make. And the reason why that is so important is because we want to really normalize for people. We make these mistakes all the time, and we want to show people, and especially as leaders, when you start to look at the mistakes you make, when you share your stories, when you're vulnerable of either a time when you received radical candor, what was it that made that radical candor for you? That can show the people you work with what sort of caring and challenging looks like for you. Very helpful. Also very helpful to share stories when you have made these mistakes. And just to kind of double click on that story that I was sharing, when I, really lost an important relationship to me because I was so worried about this person's feelings. And then it was so much worse, right? But if I'm really honest with myself, Greg, what's really interesting about kind of that left side of the framework, ruinous empathy, manipulative, and we could talk about the word manipulative, but there was a part of me, if I'm honest, probably a big part of me that didn't tell him because I was more worried about myself. I didn't want to deal with his emotional response. 9 times out of 10, he was jump up and go, do everything. 1 time out of 10, he got very angry and yelled a lot, and I wanted to avoid that conflict. I also, the people-pleasing part of me, I wanted everyone to like me. I didn't want to be sort of the bad guy and be the one giving the feedback. So that's what we mean by that manipulative insincerity, that I'm more focused on myself rather than being helpful to that other person. And both of those were happening in that story. And that's why emotional intelligence, self-awareness, emotional management, really being willing to look at yourself in the mirror to realize what's going on for me here. Why am I not sharing this with this person?
Well, so look, when you come into an organization, you have to introduce this concept. People do the course, they read the book, they get a foundation for the work.
Yeah.
They understand the foundation. And I always wonder, because, you and I are working remotely right now, which most people do. It's very common. How can leaders practice radical candor effectively in a virtual environment where really the body language and the tone are kind of harder to convey? I mean, if I was sitting in a room with you right now, even doing this interview, it would be completely different because we'd see each other's body language. Certain things, I've seen podcasts where they do them live, right? Meaning live, I'm in the same room with you.
Yeah.
How can people practice this in remote work and do it effectively?
It's such a great question. I will say Radical Candor as a company, and we've been growing from 3, 5, 9, et cetera. Plus we've got coaches. We've always been remote. The guidance that Kim initially wrote in the book was before COVID, before this sort of remote revolution. And so one of the pieces of the guidance was to have these conversations in person. So we adapted. We actually adapted doing our workshops from, in person to remote. And then we shifted our guidance to wanting to do this more, like job one would be in a video call, so we could have the body language and see what was happening. Now there's actually some interesting research coming up that in some ways there's almost more noise than signal coming through in video. And maybe it's actually better to have a phone call and be able to, walk, etc. And so I'd say the most important thing is that different medium are going to work better for different people, whether it's in person versus phone versus video. The most important thing, our recommendation is real time, that we are able to have a back and forth conversation. In other words, like, please don't break up with people by text. Like we want to be able to have these conversations in real time.
I was going to say text or email should be at the bottom of the list.
100%. Yeah.
On the list.
Yeah. And we don't, this is a real time conversation, not an email, not a text. Now, I'm someone that likes to put my thoughts together in writing and then deliver it in real time. And so that can be very helpful. I can certainly share with you the model that we like to prepare our feedback and how we like to do this. But just to share one bit more about the remote, I do think we need to be a bit more intentional about the relationship building part of it. So whether that's a few minutes, at the top of a meeting, checking in on how someone is doing, whether, we really want to have these conversations in a one-on-one setting. And the most building these, what I would call radically candid relationships, Greg, is to actually start by asking for feedback. So we want to do this in a one-on-one setting. And let's say, Greg, you and I start working on a project together. We're going to be, working on a new podcast together. I would want to set up whether it's a weekly meeting, bi-weekly meeting, where we kind of have this standing meeting where we can check in and see what's working, what's going well, what we could improve on. And I would want to really make sure that in that meeting, I solicited feedback from you and say like, hey, Greg, like, what's your working style? Like, how can we address issues as they come up? Maybe I would ask, what was a partnership or a boss you had that you really appreciated? So I can know kind of what radical candor looks like for you. So I would want to start by asking for feedback from you, whether it's about communication style, whether it's about how I can be a better partner with you, etc.
The other thing I would say, and I know you know this, but, I, having come from a background in psychology, and I've taught this to so many people, reframe the question saying, this is what I heard you say, and then say what you heard them say and let them respond. Because the reality is, clarity of communication is probably the most important thing where there's no misunderstanding. So the little statement that, if I'm right, this is what I heard you say, right, Amy? And you go, yeah, that's exactly what I heard you say. It helps me so much to stay on track, stay focused, and make certain that everybody is clear with the communication. Would you say that that's a good bit of advice?
I think the biggest mistake in communication is thinking that it happened, right? So I love that. Yeah, absolutely. Saying, framing what I heard, we do a listening exercise in our workshops, kind of a mindful listening focus exercise where we actually don't repeat back. It's sort of at the far end of a listening exercise. Mm-hmm. And one of the benefits of those exercises is that you get to really notice your patterns in communication. The kind of listening that you're talking about, more generous listening or active listening, where you repeat back, I love that because it forces you to really be present and hear what that person is saying, right? So that's important for you. It helps the other person feel heard. I think we all, that have this fundamental need to be understood. It also allows you as the speaker to clarify your own thinking. It's like, oh, yeah, I did say that. Let me tweak that a little bit. What I was really trying to say here was this. Does that help clarify it for you, right? Because any of these conversations, radical candor, communication, it's a two-way street. If I'm going to share a challenge with you, then I need to expect a challenge back. So yes, I love that. This is what I heard you say. And the other reason why I think that's so important, going back to even phrases like how the phrase manipulative insincerity lands for you, is because these words, we all bring to these words our own lived experiences, and certain words are going to have all of these different meanings for us.
Well, and I remember in the course that I took, one of the terms that was used was loving kindness.
Yeah.
And it was used, quite frequently, actually. So with you were doing either a trio or a dyad with somebody and working with them and counseling. Loving kindness was like the umbrella that fell over this whole thing. And I think that's partially what you're speaking. You don't use the word loving. I get that. I don't know if that would be 100% accepted in corporate 101, but I think more and more. Now, you basically, there are ways that leaders have to build trust with teams. Okay. Yes. And most people today, whether they're building software or they're working in innovation or design, they've got to do it. While implementing radical candor, especially they haven't been practicing any kind of direct feedback before, where would you, or how would you help the people out there in teams today to learn how to practice direct feedback before, so that it could be more effective, especially as a team? Because I think teams frequently, this is what I've noticed, it can be one-way communication coming from the supervisor or whoever, and they've got a team on Zoom or in person, and it's like, hey, this is what we're doing, guys. But there's so little inclusion. There's so little feedback, right? And I want you to comment on that, because obviously doing the work that you've done, you know how important it is to have inclusion.
Absolutely. I mean, you're talking about a lot of different ideas here, trust, inclusion. I think one of the biggest challenges is where we might have a lot of feedback debt. We might have technical debt, financial debt. Often organizations might have feedback debt, and an even bigger idea of, how do you build trust? How do you build psychological safety? Kim Scott and Amy Edmondson, who really coined the term psychological safety, she's a professor at Harvard Business School, talks a lot about how practicing candor goes hand in hand with safety. And I think if you want to start building a radically candid culture, you've got to, I think, really start small, kind of start where you are. So first of all, that we may not be able to change the culture of a whole organization or company. I always like to start where I am. So whether I'm the CEO, whether I'm, kind of middle manager, whether I'm an individual contributor, just what's the first thing that I can start to do? How can we almost create like pockets of excellence, around where we are? So for me, I would, start with a few different people that I could start soliciting their feedback in a one-on-one conversation over the next few weeks. And if I'm a leader, I would share that feedback publicly, whether they wanted it to be attributed or not, but just say, I've heard that I'm talking a lot in meetings and inclusion is a really important value. And so going forward in our meetings, I'm going to assign someone to kind of keep an eye on, timing and space so that, people really have a voice. So that's kind of thing one, is I would start by soliciting feedback, share publicly, and start putting that into place. We talk about sort of our order of operations. So start by asking for feedback, and then of specific and sincere public praise with the people I'm working with, not just what they did, but the impact they had. So the model that we like to use for both praise and criticism, we adapted from the SBI model from the Center for Creative Leadership. We call it CORE: context, observation, result, and expected next step. So a piece of public praise could be like, hey, Greg, when you asked me that question about, how people can start to implement it. So, in the podcast, when you asked me that question, the observation, the context was the, sort of the podcast, and the observation was the question that you just asked. So I'm looking for work product or behavior. What's the result? Like, what is the most meaningful impact of that? There could be a variety of different ways I want to think about it, but for me, the most important result is that it gives me a chance to provide your listeners with meaningful tips they can put into practice right away. Like, that's the number one impact. Probably be other different ones. So, right. So on the podcast, when you asked me the question about what people can do, it gave me the chance to give them some more practical tips. And then expected next steps is could be just keep doing it. Like praise, it can be just keep it up, sort of that ongoing challenge. It also could be like, share with other podcast hosts, how do you prepare for podcasts so that you can most be effective, right? So we want to share the wealth. And when we start focusing on praise, focus on the good stuff, and the why and the impact, not just great job, that's not helpful praise. What's helpful praise is what was it that made it good so that people can start to replicate it.
Your answer to the question was excellent. And I think if all of the podcast listeners get this far in the podcast, this podcast was worth what Amy just said. Because my feeling is not only one, I heard core, and then I heard also behind what you were saying, this needs to become part of your DNA. This needs to become who you are as a leader. Not like, oh, well, I'm being told I have to do this because this is what I've got to do. No, this is what you should want to do because this is going to make things so much smoother in communication, more open. You're going to get honest feedback. That feedback loop is so important. And I want to ask this question. Many workplaces, they struggle with kind of this passive aggressive behavior or toxic communication, right? How can leaders use radical candor to transform a culture where open communication has really been lacking? And I know I tell people when I go into a business as an advisor, I could tell them that I could cut the air with a knife because it felt like that. In other words, it was so heavy. Everything was heavy. Everybody felt suppressed. I can remember a time when I was 17 and I went over the Berlin Wall into the communist area. And it was almost like that same experience because you felt like everybody was repressed. Everybody was doing what they were supposed to be told, but nobody was happy doing what they were doing, right? So I know that's a weird analogy, but when I was young and I went into Russia, or I should say East Berlin, not Russia. The reality was I felt so just small, little.
Well, I find that a really powerful story, and it shows that, a lot of what we're talking about is kind of invisible, right? In a sense of, these one-on-one conversations and of these cultures. When we're thinking about, one of my favorite lines that Kim shared in Radical Candor was this idea that relationships don't scale, but culture does. And this idea that we build culture through these more radically candid relationships. So I would build on what I shared as my initial guidance, which is as leaders, starting with ourselves. It's one of my favorite things about working at Radical Candor is that it's the first time I've actually worked in a place where we are putting these ideas into practice. And thank goodness, because we're teaching it. But so often we'll work in organizations and we'll have certain values and mission statements, et cetera. And yet there's not that alignment of what we are doing. So if you are a leader, first of all, what are you hearing from your overall listening? Not one-on-one listening, but one-to-many listening in terms of data like your engagement surveys, your turnover numbers. Are people, right, sort of quiet quitting and all of these things. And so when you think about building this culture, again, starting small, modeling it. The other thing is when I was talking about sharing your stories, it can be very helpful for leaders to start to look at, here's what radical candor means to me. Here's why I'm implementing it. And when you get criticism, to treat it like gold. When leaders start sharing criticism that they have received, that is when we are modeling that it is okay to share, and that's safety.
That's
last thing I'll say, that one other thing leaders, I'm sorry?
I'd say that is open communication.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll share, what leaders can do, is that the one time we don't want to encourage listening is when people come to you and, Adam's complaining to me about Ben, and Ben is complaining to me about Adam. That is when we want the two of them talking to each other. That's where we can start to cut down on these side conversations. If you can get together, then we would want you to be with your managers, have us all together. And Kim talks a lot about in the book, speak truth to power meetings, where you can have kind of skip level meetings. In fact, we just recently did those where we were having meetings. Jason was leading meetings talking about Kim. Kim was leading meetings talking about Jason. So if we had not felt safe to give the feedback to them individually because of their power in the organization, this is a place to do that. And so acknowledging that it is hard to speak truth to power and creating systems and processes in the organization where people can safely speak up and try to lay that power down.
Well, Amy, it's been an honor having you on the show. And for all my listeners, the book is Radical Candor. Go out and get a copy. We'll put a link. We'll also put a link to the website, radicalcandor.com. You can learn more about this book. You can learn more about their trainings. You can actually see Amy on the podcast. There's plenty of episodes up there for you to take a listen to so that you can get a better idea. Now, wrapping this up, I always like to have a final question here. We see, or what we perceive, and I think much of the world perceives, is this ever-evolving workplace. It's happening very rapidly. Things seem to be happening faster. And again, I'll say perception, but I would say to much respect to everybody, that's their reality. How would, in this hybrid work world, in the work world where we're working today, can radical candor stay relevant? In other words, what is it that you would tell people, and what are 3 takeaways that they could use?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, we're kind of busier than ever. I think, to your point, people are stressed. There's so much information, so much that people have to respond to and have to adapt. And we have adapted the content as needed, but that's why we're not so prescriptive. So number 1, these are about building more trusting one-on-one relationships. How do you do that? Start by asking for feedback. I really liked your tip about listening. When you ask for the feedback, not just repeat back what you heard, but put it into practice. Reward the candor. Fix what you can fix. And if you can't fix it, explain why you have a different perspective on it, but make sure that you follow up. So ask for feedback, reward the candor, and share your stories. I mean, the part that AI is not replacing is our human experience, our lived experience, our stories. And when we share what radical candor looks like for us, times when we've received it, times when we mess up, and when we hear what that looks like, we can build new definitions of what these words mean based on each of our own experience. So share your stories.
Hey, well, great wisdom. And I think tonight we're going to get a dose of radical candor. For all of you who are listening, there's going to be a presidential debate.
Hopefully compassionate candor. That'll be my vote.
I'm not certain it's going to all be compassionate, but the reality is it's going to be interesting. And I think millions of my listeners will have either tuned in by now because they're listening to this podcast later than the actual event itself. But commentary-wise, we'll get to see your work in progress on the debate stage. So thank you so much for being on Inside Personal Growth again, and for sharing your wisdom and insights from the years of experience as somebody who taught mindfulness, meditation, search inside yourself, and comes with just such a great background to be able to speak about this. Namaste to you. Thank you for your wonderful interview here today, and I look forward to some in the future.
Thanks, Greg. It was wonderful to connect. Thank you for your presence and lovely questions. A lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to this podcast on Inside Personal Growth. We appreciate your support. And for more information about new podcasts, please go to InsidePersonalGrowth.com or any of your favorite channels to listen to our podcast. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day.